you got in your mind?
I was just curious as to what the evidence is supposed to be regarding the prompt there.
Gotcha. So it comes down fundamentally to this idea at which cause and effect is fundamental and foundational within our reality. And that when we look into the double slit experiment, we observe this phenomena at which we haven't yet determined the cause. And that there are theories being presented, and that the theories that reject cause and effect are the theories that I have contention with.
You'll have to be more specific than that.
Specifically, in that what is typically rejected in regards to cause and effect of these particles reacting in ways that we don't know, it's the idea of interference that is then presented. So, for example, when we implement a measuring device into the experimentation, these measuring devices will shoot anywhere from 1 to 2 photons at the electron or whatever particle is being experimented with. And that the theory is that in implementing the measuring device that shoots 1 to 2 photons at the particle going through the slits is interfering, causing the change that we're observing. Now, if that theory were to be true and that the particles themselves are causing the change from the interference, then by changing the lights in the room or turning them on and off, introducing billions of photons into the experiment, we would observe a change in the results of the experiment. But that's not what we see. So we're left with alternatives of we don't know, or we maintain the idea of cause and effect, at which, to me, the strongest standing theory that I'm not going to be able to then jump to proving to you, but there's legitimate experimentation that you can apply into your life to proving this to yourself through personal experience. And that consciousness is foundational to existence, and that the reason these particles are acting these ways is simply because of consciousness interfering with the experiment.
Okay. There's quite a lot to parse there. Give me a second to take a look at something here. I feel like you have I think you might have part of this backwards, the whole thing about interference. So when you run the experiment, if you don't put any detectors to see which slit it goes through, then it creates an interference pattern, which is just a wave-like pattern. And so photons are waves, or even electrons behave like waves. But then when you try to detect which slit it goes through, then the interference pattern disappears. So actually, weirdly, when we interfere or intervene or whatever in the experiment, then the interference pattern actually completely disappears. Now, is there some kind of interference that is happening when when you let the experiment run without trying to measure which slit it went through? Maybe in some quantum mechanical sense, there is some sort of interference. But when you say interference is causing the wave pattern, actually, when we, the way I understand it, when we try to interfere, that's actually when the wave pattern collapses. So there's that. And then you said stuff about consciousness or whatever, but your prompt says that you're God's child, and I didn't hear a defense on that in anything.
In that, if consciousness is foundational, your consciousness individually is constructing and creating reality. In other words, you're a baby creator in this world. But as far as the interference goes with the experiment, what's the mechanism that's interfering, causing the change?
Well, when a photon strikes another photon, that changes its momentum. And that's a huge part of why well, it's not exactly that it changes its momentum, but anytime you interfere with it, the wave function collapses. And so if it's not a wave function, if it's not a wave, then it's going to act like a particle, which is why when we try to do that, you get the two distinct markings behind it rather than the wave like appearance, the interference pattern. But what you're describing sounds like idealism. Do you know what I mean by that? So idealism is the idea that consciousness, there's something about quantum mechanics where consciousness is sort of fundamental.
Okay.
But the problem with that is that idealists don't even think that there is a wave function. They don't think that the wave function ever, well, they might believe that there is a wave function, but they don't believe that it ever actually collapses.
Idealism is a funny conversation from their perspective, but that's not the perspective that I'm taking fully, and that I understand their point of view, but there's a lot more going on. But to go back to more of the cause and effect within the experiment and dissecting
Oh yeah, I forgot cause and effect, right?
This reaction that is very heavily contended within the community of quantum physicists, and that as we go back to dissecting the experiment, in that when we're introducing this measuring device, as we're trying to observe what slit it's going through, that measuring device is only shooting anywhere from 1 to a couple photons at a time. And that a light bulb, a standard light bulb, when we flip a switch and turn that light bulb on, produces billions of photons at a time. And that if the theory is that 1 or 2 photons is causing the change by interfering with those quantum particles going through the slits, by turning on a light and introducing billions, we should get another change or reaction. But we don't. And that's where I have a problem with saying that this is the reason or this is the interference that's causing the change, because there's no consistency within the data. Now, in regards to considering other theories, this is where consciousness comes into play, and that if consciousness is foundational to our experience, and that it is in fact causing the change of these quantum particles and how they're reacting, the further implications of that are continuing that chain of cause and effect. I should be able to change my thoughts and beliefs to change my emotions, and I should be fully in control of that, which seems a bit simple and not enough to say God. But then if I'm able to then change my emotions when looking at and questioning and contending with the idea that my brain is producing waves, my heart is producing a heartbeat, and that this information is leaving my body, is it or could it be interacting with something outside of my body?
Okay, that went in many different directions again, but initially, so I wish I could tell you more about this. Unfortunately, I'm not a physicist and I can't, but you, at the beginning there, seemed to be saying that there's some sort of inconsistency because you can do the double slit experiment, but then if you introduce photons, it changes it or whatever. The interference pattern that you get, it does not require a vacuum to do that. You can do a double slit experiment, like literally in a dark room with just like, you might need a laser beam. I don't think a flashlight will work, but if you just use a laser beam and cut slits the right way, you can get an interference pattern. And obviously, even in a dark room, there are going to be photons from the environment that get in there. So, it's not the existence of other photons messing with the photons that makes the interference pattern disappear. It's not that, because you can do it in a room with photons. It's when you try to make a measurement about which slit it's going through. And now this is where I don't know what to tell you, because if there's photons in the room, there's photons in the slit as well. but you'll still get the interference pattern unless you create a detector device. So I don't know exactly what's changing there. I wish I knew it to tell you. So unfortunately, that's that. But then you said
Oh,
my
go ahead. You can.
yeah. But then you said something at the end. My brain makes waves. My heart makes energy. Could it be interacting with something outside my body? Obviously our bodies and the energy that our bodies produce interacts with the environment. But where are we going with this?
In that there is continuously cause and effect within this reality, and that if it's interacting with something, we're acknowledging cause and effect. We might not be able to prove at the moment, but if we say it's not interacting with something, we're dismissing cause and effect, and then we're foundationally dismantling science and how all logic and reason was built from those perspectives. So
Right. And what is it about quantum mechanical interpretations that you think dismisses the concept of cause and effect? Because you said something about that earlier, but I don't know what it was.
dismissing the possibility that consciousness is the cause or the mechanism that's creating the change.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't agree with that at all either. I think if you built an experimental apparatus but didn't look at it, then the wave function would still collapse. So then your only choice is to say that consciousness is fundamental, which is either idealism or panpsychism, depending on, I'm not very good at remembering exactly the difference between those two, but they both believe there's a fundamental aspect of consciousness in there. But that's just a metaphysical interpretation of what you think is going on. And I don't think metaphysics, like you can't science metaphysics. You just can't. All science is going to come with metaphysical baggage, and that's just a worldview that you're going to have to adopt. That is that you just think works better for you, I guess.
Can you help me understand more on how we can't science metaphysics?
Well, because metaphysical ideas are just completely unfalsifiable. They're non-empirical, so they're not subject to the scientific method.
I guess could you be a little bit more specific? I mean, because what I'm seeing is we can interact and manipulate quantum particles, and that we do understand that there is a connection from our thoughts to our body. So there's all these different areas where we can zoom out and zoom in to where we have control and observable interactions from that point of control. So I guess where is that, I guess, scientific disconnect from this?
Well, again, because metaphysical claims are not testable. They do not produce any kind of evidence or anything like that. So there are multiple metaphysical interpretations of quantum mechanics. There's by multiple, I mean there's three that I know of. There's many worlds, there's the Copenhagen interpretation, and then there's idealism. And they all just make different claims. One claims that there are multiple universes where every single possible way, in like the electron, for example, exists in a probability space, and every single possible way, location, whatever, that electron could end up in really does happen in causally disconnected universes. Another one says, no, it only, and that's the many worlds interpretation. The Copenhagen says that it only actually collapses. There's one wave function collapse. Idealism says that the wave function doesn't actually collapse in any way. None of those are actually scientifically testable. It's sort of like, I mean, I don't know. It's like any other kind of philosophy, like ethics. You can't scientifically test beauty. or I don't know what would be another good example, like Platonism. We cannot scientifically test whether or not Plato's realm of forms is a real thing out there. It's not subject to science.
Gotcha. Okay. So there are ways at which, I guess, if you accept this or reject this, let me know. And that there are ways that we can test beauty, and that we can't really pin it down. We can understand through scientific experimentation this subjectivity within the general population associated to the idea of beauty, but we can't pinpoint it because that's simply just a subjective idea or a metaphysical idea that's fundamentally subjective. But there's still ways at which we can pin down data in association to that metaphysical idea and how it relates to our reality.
Yeah, I
So
mean, you could ask people their opinion, but that doesn't really tell you whether or not something is like real, I guess.
Gotcha. Okay, so that's the metaphysical perspective of like how do we prove anything's real? That I guess, do you take that perspective so I can better understand how to navigate the conversation? Like, do you accept that we can't prove external reality? Is that your view?
No, I don't think that.
Yeah, okay.
I'm experiencing reality right now.
Yes. Okay. Fine. I misunderstood that perspective then. Okay. So I guess, do you have contention then with the idea that we can, to a degree, experiment with these ideas and scientifically extract data on the interaction or integration of these ideas metaphysically into the physical world and its association, but we can't get necessarily all data points that we want at this particular moment in time. So there's certain things that we can't test to certain extents.
I mean, there are, like, all science has to come with some sort of philosophical baggage. Like I kind of said that earlier. And that doesn't bother me. But for me, I think that science is, I think it's awesome. But what I really mean by that is science is merely pragmatic. Okay. It's a very good tool. And whatever types of philosophical undergirdings or understandings you want to bring into science, I think it should only serve in the interest of making science more pragmatic. If I adopt the idea that consciousness is fundamental, can I actually do more and better science with that? I don't think that you can for that specific one. But at the same time, I kind of sort of don't really care. And when people try to use science to try to justify things that aren't scientific, I think they're actually kind of violating the spirit of science in a pretty deep way.
Okay, so you foundationally understand that in order for us to be able to, I don't like using the word scientifically test the metaphysical aspect based on the language that you're using, but for lack of a better way of describing this, based on your language, that there's a limitation for scientifically testing the metaphysical aspect of our reality. However, in order to be scientifically sincere, that we should do our best with the due diligence and the understanding that we have in moving forward in that direction without dismissing or dismantling what we understand already about science and physics and reality.
Sure.
Okay. So that's my perspective, and that I don't negate that or contradict that at any point in my perspective, and that my view is complicated and confusing, and that there's a lot to navigate through and a lot of nuances or misunderstandings, but I never contradict that idea. So kind of this is where going back to the basics of what I initially presented in the double slit experiment, and that when we go back to that point and trying to begin to test, is consciousness foundational and being sincere in our doing of our due diligence, that within the double slit experiment, if we have all variables consistent, except for the introduction of the measuring device, that measuring device is only producing anywhere from 1 to 2 photons, and by introducing that and changing nothing else, that creates the change, which is where all of this confusion has originated from. So, in re experimenting to where we keep everything the same, but then we change the lights in the room, introducing or removing, maybe not completely, but there's a massive change in the experiment as far as the amount of photons. Again, to be more specific, a light bulb produces billions, but the measuring device that we know caused the change, that created the interference, is only 1 to 3 photons. Very, very small amount. So by changing the lights in the room, we're changing or introducing or removing billions of photons. By the theory that the interference is coming from that measuring device, the lights should then also create a change within the experiment because we're interfering with the amount of photons in the experiment. But we don't see that. That's kind of where the diligence and the desire of maintaining scientific consistency is looking for another explanation that doesn't reject a possibility, that is consistent with the idea of cause and effect through maintaining the idea of interference.
Okay, so we're back to something that we were talking about earlier, and I said I don't really know what to tell you. So I typed in the question to ChatGPT because I actually want to know too. So take this with as many grains of salt as you think ChatGPT requires, but I think you would be interested in hearing like what the response is. So, in order to make a measurement of a photon, you have to bounce another photon off of it because that's how you get information about it. And so that's what happens when we try to measure it. So then I asked it, then why do we ever get an interference pattern? Because there's always ambient photons around. And this is what it says. Those don't count as measurements in a quantum sense. For a quote-unquote measurement to destroy interference, the environment or an observer must gain which path information that is in principle accessible. And I already don't know what that means. Random photons in the room are usually too weak or too delocalized or too uncorrelated with the electron's state to encode usable which slit it went from data. And so as long as no information about the electron path exists, even in principle, the superposition is preserved and you get an interference pattern. So I think what this is telling you is, yeah, there are always ambient photons, but in the general environment, but the general environment isn't localized to those slits themselves. So it doesn't give you any useful information. Now, to me, that's still frustrating because I'm thinking, well, yeah, but it should still collapse at some point. But maybe there are so many interferences that happen along the way that it just can always lead to a wave function pattern or an interference pattern. I don't know. So
this could just be the litigator in me that, as my career, having to interpret hundreds of pages of insurance policy and navigate through contractual law, I interpreted that as it stating that the contingency of this change is the observer.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't change the observer. What it's saying is that all of the interference that goes on beyond the experimental apparatus, because it's not localized to the apparatus, you can't deduce any measurements or information from them because they're everywhere and they're random and they're not really connected in a way in which you're doing the measurement.
Yeah, so it's stating that the change is dependent on the measurement, and that in order to measure something, you need a conscious observer. You can't measure anything without consciousness.
So no, there's no consciousness that is actually collapsing the wave function here. It's just the photons. It's just the only way that you can know that is if you look at it, and so like you're the conscious agent there. I don't really know why the idealists think that even the photons are fundamentally conscious for whatever reason. I don't really know what their argument is for that, but pretty much everybody except the idealists disagrees that no, there's no consciousness happening in the machinery. When we look at it, we're a conscious entity taking part, but other than that, no.
Yeah, so it's this idea of direct and indirect connection from consciousness to quantum particles, and that we know that quantum particles are indirectly connected, and that there's not a physical connection, and that we can split a photon, send it 14 miles apart, manipulate one quantum particle, and the other one reacts the exact same way. It's this idea of Wi-Fi, and that this field is somehow, whether you want to perceive it as intelligently connected or non-intelligently connected, but there's an indirect connection that is allowing all this information to communicate, to essentially make this reality and have things react the way that they do. But within that experiment, I think we agree, and ChatGPT is stating that this is contingent on measurement, and that's the language that it's using, which is the general language. That the measurement
Yeah.
itself is where the change occurs.
Yeah, like, well, you could say the act of measurement makes it change, but I think it's just the act of the thing going through the experimental apparatus. Measurement's kind of loaded because I make the measurement by looking at it, but the circumstances that produce the data that lets me make a measurement are just inherent in the system, and that's just a physical thing.
Well, measurement's not loaded. That's what ChatGPT said, and that the introduction of measurement causes the change.
Well, yeah, but a what I'm telling you is a machine doesn't really make a measurement, right? The machine just exists, right? A measurement is something that the data that produces the measurement, like, or whatever, is there, but it's just a little bit loaded because measurement sounds like an intentional action. And no, I don't think machines have intentional actions.
Yeah, I agree with that. But that's where we still have to ask the question of what is the mechanism that is making the change within the experiment? That's the begging question. And the answers to that question are it's the direct physical interference from the machine itself, or it's not. And
Yeah, and I think that's what it is.
And that's where the introduction of lights in the room and the billions of photons, because those machines are specifically designed to bounce anywhere from 1 to 2 or 3 photons off
Yep.
of the particle that's getting shot through the slits to then bounce off to be able to observe which slit it's going through. And that it's only 1 to 3 photons, and comparing that to billions from a light bulb.
I don't know if that's
That's-
the case. I know they are designed to only shoot that many photons through the slits, but I don't know if I don't think I would say it's the case that they only send. That would actually never work because I know that they design it so they can only shoot like one or a couple photons at the machine at a time. But if the detector is also only doing that, then you would never detect a photon because like no matter how small those slits are, a photon is so unbelievably smaller than that if you were only trying to hit one photon with one photon, that would be like 2 grains of sand being thrown into the ocean and hoping that they'll bump into each other.
Yeah, so there's different measuring devices that are used dependent on the particle that's being shot through the slits. So like, for example, when we're utilizing a measuring device that's only shooting 1 to 3 photons, we're shooting that not against a photon. We'll utilize a different measuring device when we're shooting the photon through the slits. But the device that is shooting the photons will typically go up against, let's say, an electron. And that we're shooting the electron through the slits as it's going forward through those slits. The measuring device is on the side, and it shoots the photons at the electron that's going through the slit, and then it bounces off. Depending on where it gets that feedback and the information that comes back to the machine, we know which slit it goes through. But it's only 1 to 3 photons that we're shooting from an angle against that electron, for
Yeah,
example.
let me grab something. I can show you something real quick. I think I kind of understand part of what's the solution here. Can you make my picture a little bit bigger?
Yeah.
Have you ever seen one of these things before?
Yes.
So what they're telling you is, so you're asking a good question, which is, well, yeah, but what about the billions of other photons? So if we look at, so this thing has all these little pegs, right? If I were to look at where, I want to make sure you can see what I'm pointing at. If I look at the very last peg and I look at the way one of the balls bounces off of it, no matter how much information or data I get about the way that ball interacted with that peg, that will not tell me anything about which of the ones up here it came from. So up here is like the detector from the double slit experiment. Down here, these are like all of the photon interactions that happen after that. And then part of the other information, and again, I'm just kind of reading it off the thing because I'm not a physicist, but those ambient photons, it says they usually don't have enough energy to localize the electron precisely. They're not correlated to the geometry of those two slits. So that's like what I was saying here. No matter how much information you get about the way the ball strikes that peg, that won't tell you if it hit this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, or any of these. It won't tell you anything about any of the ones that came before it. And then this last part, I don't really understand, but maybe look it up sometime. It says that those ambient photons afterwards, they don't produce any distinguishable outcomes that are encoded with information about which slit they passed through. So that's why it doesn't, it's not a, those things just don't pose a problem. And that's what the LLM is telling me that the physics are saying about it. I do only have about 5 more minutes here, just FYI.
Yeah, yeah. So with what you explained, there's no contention in that. That's a scientifically accurate way of explaining from that particular perspective or experiment. But there's not a direct one-to-one in the analogy, in that the difference is you're correct in stating that when you're looking at a sequence or a chain of cause and effect, and you're observing an effect and you're trying to figure out what the prior cause is, you don't look at 10 past prior potential causes. You try to look for the one that's most closely related to that, and you consider all possibilities, and you experiment with all possibilities to that direct tie where that change occurs. So as far as the balls bouncing from higher up, there's a lot of other prior causes to why the ball ended up in that one position to hit that final peg and go either left or right. So when looking at the chain, we want to begin to consider that, okay, if we're changing the amount of photons in the experiment and that's not changing the effect, we have to set that aside. And we have to consider another possibility, that there's another cause to this effect. And that the only standing theory that I have at this moment, and that nobody's been able to present me with anything else without dismantling cause and effect, dismantling the foundation of science, but maintaining cause and effect, is the idea that it's consciousness. And that, again, you're God's kid. And by changing your mind, you'll change your experience. And that experience, your heartbeat, your brain waves, they go out. And it's, again, this idea of, you could say New Age or manifestation, but we understand that cause and effect doesn't stop working in our reality. And that information is going out. We accept and understand this idea of quantum entanglement, that particles can be fully separated, yet it's this giant, intelligent, integrated system that's constantly communicating, sending information back and forth. leaving the speculation in the possibility of what if you're a creator. And by changing your mind, you can change your experiences.
Yeah, I mean, we'll probably have to leave it at that. If I wanted to say anything about that, it would take more time than I have.